Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Raymond Raconteur, and this weekend I did sort of a Jane Austen July weekend. That event on BookTube, of course, is being hosted by Katie at Books and Things and Marissa at Blatantly Bookish, and I'll link their channels in the description box below. But when I wasn't, doing some work on the yard and playing with my daughters and writing honors chemistry and brief calculus courses online for my school district, my wife and I took time together. So we watched a modern screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, that being Clueless from 1995. It's sort of like inspired by Emma. I don't know that I would say it's a direct adaptation, but it's very much inspired by Emma. It's one of my wife's favorite comedies. We both laughed extremely hard as we watched it, rewatched it, many times over now. And then I also read Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, which I really, really enjoyed. There was so much to like about this. There were a number of the characters. There's one character I despise. There's a couple of characters I just loved. Brian at Bookish had his question around, like, oh, do you, if you sub-vocalize, does that make you more likely to, develop a crush on a character? And I not only sub-vocalize, I read frequently to my daughters, which means that I sub-vocalize audibly to them, and I have a tendency to read like different voices for characters. Sometimes it drives my wife crazy. But I'm also, I'm a runner. I've coached cross-country and track. I've run cross-country track for years. I'm from the pre-iPod generation where either the CD player was skipping or I was too cool to use a Walkman. So I would tell myself stories while I was going out and running for an hour in my middle school and my teens. That continued even after iPods came out, like when I was in late high school and college. I still won't run with headphones in. I just go and run and tell myself stories. So I'm like the, godfather of sub-vocalization. Anyway, Sense and Sensibility. I loved this book. I really enjoyed it. So I really enjoy Pride and Prejudice, and this feels like the reverse side of the coin that is Pride and Prejudice. The fact that Austen wrote them sort of like back to back, I think really pushes that aspect of what I find to enjoy in both of them. The characters, of course, are great. I will say about Elinor that I pretty much am married to Elinor. I'm not Edward Ferrars, but I'm essentially married to Elinor. That my wife, I love my wife dearly, and my wife is an extremely sensible person. She helps me stay grounded. But she also has that aspect of she's full of feelings, she's full of romance, she's full of joy and energy. We have, since the quarantine started, we basically have family dance parties almost probably 5 nights a week. We had one this evening to the Four Tops, and it was a delight. As I was reading the character of Elinor, I was just very much feeling like, okay, this is the woman I love and that I'm actually married to in real life. And here's a fictional version of my life, like in an alternate reality. So I loved that about Sense and Sensibility. Sir John. So everybody knows Sir John, like the guy, the person. I shouldn't say guy, but in this case, it's a guy who has to like come in and like interrupt everything and change everything, brings extra people to the party, and so of course, I as Austen describes Sir John, I'm thinking of someone in my life, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I went in and told my wife, and she was laughing uproariously. So there was so much to enjoy about this book. I really, really, really liked it. It feels very informed by the high romantic movement that's going on in England at the same time as this book is written. So this was published in the early 1810s, or 18 teens, and I believe. And like Lord Byron is writing his early works right as maybe Mansfield Park is being published. So almost at the same time, Jane Austen is like fully into writing her novels, and Byron is starting to write his poetry. Of course, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Blake, they've been writing. Shelley and Keats are coming along. And there's this aspect of Jane Austen that, particularly in Sense and Sensibility, where she's kind of doing a send-up, not just of the society and building a very compassionate and humane satire on her society, but also very, it's kind of a send-up of the entire high romantic movement. And if you know much about Byron, you can see why it's not hard to do that. But so you have that aspect. You also have the aspect of her character, her writing and her dialogue is so strong, to almost Shakespearean in the way that she builds characters out of her dialogue. And there were a lot of early novels throughout history. Many of the early novels almost tried to be like just massive plays with loads of pages. Characters just kept talking. There was no sense of a narrator creating a setting, and so the characters would just talk and mention everything in the setting so that now, like, you know where they're at. Austen does not do that with her novels, and that tradition had disappeared by the time she's writing in the early 19th century. But she captures that ability to create just characters with dialogue. So I want to read a little bit about two characters that I don't like. That would be Mr. John and Mrs. Fanny Dashwood. So, "It was my father's last request to me," replied her husband, "that I should assist his widows and daughters. He did not know what he was talking of, I dare say. 10 to 1, but he was light-headed at the time. Had he been in his right senses, he could not have thought of such a thing as begging you to give away half your fortune from your own child. He did not stipulate for any particular sum, my dear Fanny. He only requested me in general terms to assist them, and make their situation more comfortable than it was in his power to do. Perhaps it would have been as well if he had left it wholly to myself. He could hardly suppose I should neglect them. But as he required the promise, I could not do less than give it. At least I thought so at the time. The promise, therefore, was given and must be performed. Something must be done for them whenever they leave Norland and settle in a new home. Well, then let something be done for them, but that something need not be 3,000 pounds. Consider," she said, "that when the money is once parted with, it never can return. Your sisters will marry, and it will be gone forever, if indeed it could ever be restored to our poor little boy." "Why, to be sure," said her husband very gravely, "that would make a great difference. The time may come when Harry will regret that so large a sum was parted with. If he should have a numerous family, for instance, it would be a very convenient addition." And so this continues as John Dashwood essentially decides to completely disinherit his half-sisters and their mother. And his venal, he of course is greedy and venal and disgusting. His wife is simply, just prodding this forward. It's very much his decision to do it, though. And a couple of times throughout the book, we just see what avaricious losers these two people are, where they wander through this dialogue where they're just conjuring up all these imaginable realities in which someone else might need that money. Well, perhaps I could give their mother some money and a little annuity. Oh, you don't want to do that. I knew someone who lasted for years, and my mother had to keep paying that person. And it's just nonsensical how greedy these people are. At one point, he later sees his half-sisters at a jewelry store, and he just immediately goes in about how expensive life is, and I was able to buy all this property, but gosh, the expense. So Austen has this ear for dialogue that is just glorious. But as I said, there is this aspect of romanticism running through the book, and so we also get the entrance of John Willoughby, who I'll talk about more at the end, like after I've finished this. And so Elinor, of course, is the more sensible sister. Marianne is the one who is more romantic and it represents the sense. But they truly are not like pigeonholed into those dichotomies. We get more of Elinor's consciousness and her wisdom and humane compassion and sensibility, and we get our sense, and then we get Marianne's sensibility where she's just enraptured and living life to the fullest, and we see how, of course, those qualities unite to make a more wonderful character for us to love. So Margaret and the youngest, Marianne and Margaret, who's the youngest sister and is almost non-existent in this book, are running down a hill. They set off. Marianne had at first the advantage, but a false step brought her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret, unable to stop herself to assist her, was involuntarily hurried along and reached the bottom in safety. A gentleman carrying a gun with 2 pointers playing around him was passing up the hill and within a few yards of Marianne when her accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to her assistance. She had raised herself from the ground, but her foot had been twisted in the fall, and she was scarcely able to stand. The gentleman offered his services, and perceiving that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary, took her up in his arms without farther delay, and carried her down the hill. Then passing through the garden, the gate of which had been left open by Margaret, he bore her directly into the house, whither Margaret was just arrived, and quitted not his hold till he had seated her in a chair in the parlour. And later on, a description of this stranger, this romantic stranger. But the influence of youth, beauty, and elegance gave an interest to the action which came home to her feelings. He was uncommonly handsome, and he received additional charms from his voice and expression. And that, of course, is John Willoughby, who is an utter scumbag. And I do not like him. But I loved Sense and Sensibility. I really enjoyed it. I had mentioned, of course, that Pride and Prejudice very much feels informed by it. Pride and Prejudice feels, it's more expansive. There are more characters. Yet there's something about Elinor and Marianne Dashwood that is just so wonderful. People talk about like the relationship between the sisters and how truly loving they are. But there's so much going on with the way that Marianne's growth, where she initially is just absolutely mocking Colonel Brandon. He's too old. He wears these flannel waistcoats. Like, well, can take that off. That's ridiculous. And Elinor, who just constantly is trying to look out for others, look out for others, look out for others, and slowly just being shattered in her heart. They're just two wonderful characters. A book that came to mind, of course, is Howard's End, written about 100 years later by EM Forster, where you have Margaret and Helen Schlegel as a pair of sisters who almost embody certain qualities of Elinor and Marianne Dashwood, and that's a very good book. And then there are aspects of Trollope's Can You Forgive Me? Particularly the bits around like Mr. Cheesacre and what is Captain Bellringer, I forget his name, where it's just like they're so funny, so nonsensical. They're trying to one-up each other in affection for different individuals. It's just very, very funny. And then the other one that I thought of was George Eliot's Middlemarch, in part because, as painful as it is to watch Dorothea Brooke marry Reverend Casaubon, the idea of Marianne Dashwood in a relationship with Reverend Casaubon would just make me laugh so hard. It would just be so awful. So I really enjoyed Sense and Sensibility. I felt the characters grew. I felt that the world was well drawn. And I can't recommend this book highly enough. And that's really all I have to say on that.